and then we'll move on. But really, when we talk about stewardship, it's not so much about the church's income or how much you're giving or resources. It isn't about the money. It's about, in stewardship, it's about the recognition that one of the primary things that we have the responsibility for is managing the influence that God has given us. Stewardship is about how we use our influence to grow God's kingdom or to grow something else. And we have more influence than we think. Last Tuesday, I was at the bank trying to get out of town. And of course, there was a huge long line at the bank when I was trying to get out of town. And there was a lady, probably about my age, and she had her, I assume, little son with her. Now, like a lot of banks, it had at the front teller desk a little candy dish with suckers. And the teller asked the mother if her son would like a sucker, which is kind of a silly question because most little kids of 3 or 4, I mean, that's just an automatic yes. And unfortunately, they weren't onion flavored. So the teller provided a sucker, and as she did, the mother leaned over and said, "Well, what do we say?" And the son said, "Charge it." Kind of a silly story. But the mother had influenced her child and how he saw the world. And it goes to show that whether it's over your kids or your coworkers or your family or your friends or neighbors, you have influence. The question is, what direction is your influence leading people? That's what Jesus is talking about in this passage. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. This is probably one of the more important speeches that Jesus gives, one of the more important teaching moments that Jesus takes advantage of. And here, in this little sliver of it, Jesus declares that if people follow Him, they need to take seriously the influence that they have and examine what direction it's taking people. And so He starts off by saying that you are the salt of the earth. Now, salt is a precious and useful thing. It was particularly precious in Jesus' time. And it was more than just a seasoning. Salt was very important. Anybody know why? It has to do with meat. Yeah, it's a preservative. It would cure meat. This is before refrigeration. And meat was a very expensive thing. And if you wanted to keep it around, you needed salt to keep it from rotting. When Jesus is saying that we are the salt of the earth, on one level He's saying that have you noticed how it's easy to be good when you're around good people, or how it's easy to be kind of rotten when you're around rotten people? But salt does other things. It flavors things. In fact, that's really what salt is good for that we think of most today. You don't eat salt on its own. It's not good on its own. What makes us good as Christians isn't how we are when we're all bundled here together. Who had salt for dinner last night as the main course? What makes us good is what happens when we spread out over the community and in our households and in the families and in the world. To me, it seems that the question when it comes to stewardship, and this is a question of for each of us as individuals and also for us collectively as the church, is if we weren't here, if we didn't exist, what flavor would be missing from the world? If we as the church aren't flavoring the world around us, flavoring it with love and goodness by bringing hope out of every hopeless situation, then we're not doing what Jesus calls us to do. In our world today, when it comes to all the claims that Christians make about love, people are saying, "Don't tell me, show me." What are we showing people in our lives and as a church about God's love? Because here's the slightly scarier, challenging part of what Jesus says. After He says that we're the salt of the earth, then He continues, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then no good. It's good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. In other words, if you just do the same things, if you keep living for yourself like everyone else, you've lost the good things that God is doing in you. You've lost the flavor that you bring to the world, and salt that's lost its flavor is good for very little. Maybe I'm just a little bit of a church nerd, but was anyone else really excited to see who the new pope was going to be this week? I have to tell the slightly embarrassing story that when he was selected, I was at this store shopping with my family, and I had my phone out, and I was watching it kind of bumping into people as the bells were ringing, and I was watching all the people celebrating because I was really interested in it. And I followed it like it was the presidential election, and I'm not even a Catholic. But what I've really appreciated more and more as I've read about Pope Francis are the ways that he has lived life in a way that is different from the world's values. When he was selected as the cardinal for the Argentina area, he could have lived in a big fancy residence in Buenos Aires that was reserved for the cardinal, but instead he moved into a little apartment and gave that big mansion to a religious order that was essentially poor and homeless. He takes public transit and has used his position to help the most marginalized in his country. When his name was announced, the poor people of Argentina, who know him so well, were the ones that were cheering the loudest for his election. I was excited when he began his tenure not with a speech or declaration, but by asking the people to pray for him before he prayed for them. What an example of a humble person. So different from what we'd expect from a great leader. The starting point for influencing others is not what you do, but who you are. When it comes to growing love in the world, the best fertilizer that helps that love to grow is a humble person and an open heart. A heart that's oriented outwardly instead of inwardly. And what then starts to grow is what Jesus talks about next. Because he switches metaphors, which he does sometimes. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill can't be hidden." We can bring illumination. We can bring people out of darkness when God's love is alive in us and shines through us. A few years ago, I was living in Las Cruces, and I had just moved from an apartment to a little duplex that was closer to where I was working. And the first night I was there, I thought that I heard somebody inside the house, and I kind of panicked. I forgot, because I had just woken up, I had forgotten that I was in this new house. So when I got up, I got up and ran off and to the right, which in the old apartment was where my light switch was. But in this new house, it was where my dresser was, and where a very, unfortunately, solid wall was also. Because it took almost a minute before I actually realized where I was. I was tripping over everything, convinced that some master burglar had created an obstacle course for me to get through to get to the light switch, until I was awake enough to realize where I was. It's a good thing no one was actually in the house. After a minute, I was able to turn on the light and see my surroundings. In the same way, Jesus seems to be saying here that the world is very lost, very turned around and in the dark sometimes, and in desperate need of a light to show where things are, to show what reality really looks like, where danger lies and where goodness is. And when we live in a way that's oriented toward love, when we decide to grow love, that's when we bring light into the world. And we have to do that, or we're salt without taste. When we live just like everyone else, when we're self-obsessed and materialistic, and when we use our influence to lavish ourselves with luxury and excess, we are failing to bring light into the world. I have a second apple, and I need a second volunteer. Now this time, do I have a volunteer? Kevin? All right, come on up, Kevin. Now, you know I wouldn't do mean things to children like twice in a row. Why don't you taste that one? Does it taste any different? How does it taste different? It kind of tastes like a regular apple, doesn't it? By the way, I forgot to give the prize to the first unfortunate taster. So will you take this to Riley, because she's earned this pack of gum by eating the onion apple. Sorry, I forgot that part of it. Yeah, that first apple, a little different. This apple, it actually was mixed with something. It was mixed with pears. And so, you know, pear juice, apple juice, pears and apples to me are almost the same thing. And so it doesn't really taste any different. Mixed with pear juice, which is really similar to apples, there isn't a difference. And the problem is were you expecting a difference, Kevin? Maybe, yeah. I mean, I'd already done, no, he says no, okay. I hoped he would expect a difference. But people expect a difference in us. And maybe Kevin's a little relieved that there isn't a difference, that it's not something worse than onion apple. But people are really disappointed when God's people are just like everyone else. When God's people come together to bring love and servanthood into a community, it's like bringing a bunch of spotlights into a dark alleyway that's in a bad neighborhood. But when we're just like everyone else, we end up being complicit with the darkness. And maybe that's just as bad, if not worse, than being part of the darkness itself. So what do we do? Well, I started this season of stewardship with a simple statement. The church doesn't exist for itself. The church exists for the world. When we come together, it's not primarily for the worship service or to share hymns. It's so that we can serve the world. When we become followers of Jesus as individuals. I mean, there are lots of good reasons to do so for salvation or to know God better. But at its core, we need to understand that when we become followers of Jesus, it's for the good of the world, not for the good of us. When we talk about giving and stewardship, we do so because at its core, it's a conversation about influence. And if we're using our influence for the world. Our church is already making itself a part of the world through the ministries that we probably know so well. Through the ways that we go beyond our own walls every single week. Through Landergan, through the Wednesday feeding. We know probably the list. Through Meals on Wheels. Through the birthday parties that groups of us, that groups of you throw at the Canyons Retirement Center. I was really excited this week on Monday night when I got to hear somebody talk about Shape Up at a meeting that I was at. This is a group of seniors that come together every week to exercise. And I like walking past the Shape Up group because they always look like they're having fun. They look like they're having as much fun as the children are doing their song. But it's also a way, you know, people have come to that who have nothing to do with our church but saw the advertisement in the newsletter and their lives are better for it. That's being salt and light in this world. So as you go from this place, consider your influence. What are you doing to bring the message of Jesus out into the world? Through the giving of yourself to this church, you can be part of something big and meaningful. If we can dream big together, we'll continue to grow into the community that God wants us to be. But we must make that commitment together. There's no standing on the sidelines. Growing in love together requires that we become part of the team. No one is interested in the win-loss record.